This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, a podcast about accountability and justice for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. It occasionally has detailed descriptions of atrocities.
There's something to be said about the very stark pattern that is seen in the 2017 operations about women and men being systematically separated and then the women being taken to the schools, being mass gang raped, and then being left to die, really.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we've done one podcast on Argentina at the centre of universal jurisdiction in relation to Venezuela.
And we know that Ukrainian torture survivors have filed a case there. I reported on that for Reuters, and we'll put a link to that also in the show notes, as well as the previous podcast we did.
But today we're actually going to be looking at the case in Argentina, and that's against 25 different Myanmar officials, including senior military and also Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a very senior advisor. And that's all for genocide and crimes against humanity. And the investigation focuses on sexual violence in relation to those crimes.
Yes, and let me, Stephopedia, here a bit about what happened when we're talking about those crimes. What we are looking at here are the 2017 clearance operations, as the Myanmar government calls them, which are actually the surge of attacks from the Myanmar army against the Rohingya Muslim minority. That violence forced more than hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to flee across the Bangladesh border. And the UN independent fact-finding mission has described these attacks as having genocidal intent, and sexual and gender-based violence was identified as one of the key factors that show this genocidal intent from these military operations that drove out the Rohingya.
Now, in 2023, 7 witnesses went to Buenos Aires to the Federal Criminal Court to the investigative hearings under universal jurisdiction to give their testimony about what happened. And in February this year, there was a court order of the first arrest warrants, including against Myanmar's self-appointed president and chief of the junta. To discuss this, we're joined now by Ishita Kumar. Hi, Ishita.
Hi, Janet. Hi, Steph. Thank you so much for having me.
Ishita is working for Legal Action Worldwide in Bangladesh with Shanti Mohila, which means Peace Women. Before I explain more about that, I have to say to our listeners that I am recording this while my neighbor has builder, so you might hear some power tools in the background. There's not much I can do about that, so sorry for that. The Shanti Mohila are a group of over 400 Rohingya women living in the refugee camps in southeastern Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar, I'm sure our listeners have heard about. They have been a part of the Argentina move and also previously took part in the genocide proceedings at the International Court of Justice. So we have a lot to talk about.
So, Ishita, maybe you can kick us off by describing these women. When I've seen material about it on your website, the women have their back towards us in order to protect their identities. So I'm sure you're not going to reveal the wrong kinds of details, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about who they are.
Right. Thanks, Steph, Janet. So the Rohingya women who are part of the Shanti Mohila network, they are all survivors of the Myanmar military's 2017 clearance operations against the Rohingya minority that Steph just spoke about. In terms of their experiences in Myanmar, we are talking about women who have faced severe sexual violence, mainly by the military. We are talking about women who were physically injured either during the course of the sexual assault or during the attacks on their villages, or even during the flight to Bangladesh, which was a very difficult journey. Their homes were destroyed. They lost their husbands, who were either taken away in front of them, never to be returned, or were fatally even shot in front of them. They lost their children during the attacks as well. And in fact, for a number of them, it was not even the first time that they were driven out of Myanmar. Prior to this forced displacement of the 700,000 Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh in 2017, there have been multiple waves of targeted violence and military operations against the Rohingya community since 1978. There was a military operation back in 91, 92 that led to forced displacement of about 250,000, and then also in 2012, followed by in 2016, prior to the 2017 operation. So you can see that it has been over 5 decades of periodic, systematic, state-backed violence we are talking about here. And on top of that, there have been a number of discriminatory laws and policies for the Rohingya, which has excluded them from citizenship, rendering them effectively stateless. In fact, in the lead up to the military operations of 2017, they were being forced to accept something called the National Verification Card that would have stripped them of their identity because it labeled them as Bengalis, meaning that they belonged to the neighboring country, Bangladesh. So they have really been living under a number of restrictions and abuse. And 2017 was not isolated attack on the Rohingya and these women by any means. It was decades in the making, really.
You talked about Shanti Mohila starting very small. Can you tell us a bit about the women who started it and how it grew?
Absolutely. So the Shanti Mohila network, it started as small as a group of 5 women, relatively older widowed women who would go door to door offering peer support to other women survivors and really just offering peer support, finding strength in one another to rebuild their lives in the camps. To give you sort of a more concrete example of some of the leaders that we are working with, currently my team at Legal Action Worldwide, we are a team of about 16 based in Cox's Bazar, and we work with 30 Shanti Mohila leaders. And one of them, for instance, has worked with us to file a complaint before the Myanmar Human Rights Commission. She is a widow who lost her husband in the infamous Indian massacre. This was an incident that happened during the 2017 operations where a group of 10 men were rounded up and executed and buried in this place called Indian. And this complaint was really first of the kind. And even though, as expected, there was no response from the Human Rights Commission, I think it really went on to show that there is absolutely no local recourse to justice in Myanmar. Another person, Hamida, she has been to The Hague as well to attend the provisional measures hearing before the ICJ. She also was one of the first Rohingya women to publicly address the Human Rights Council back in 2019. So these are really sort of the kind of women we are working with. They have really refused to sort of give in to the hopelessness that very understandably comes with the camp life as a stateless person. They are incredibly inspiring to work with. They unfortunately don't know how to read and write, which is something that's very characteristic of the Rohingya society, unfortunately, because of their decades of lack of access to education. But these women really have shown the keenness to learn.
Would I imagine that it's a relatively conservative society that they come from, kind of conservative gender norms, but these women are, I mean, as you say, some of them are widows, so maybe they have some kind of space of their own, or are they taking space? Are they saying, no, we need to stand up as women?
I would say the latter, Janet, because they have had to really take up the space since the Rohingya society is highly conservative for girls and women. It's a patriarchal society, which is not far from the norm in South Asia. So there's really no space for women, irrespective of their age and status as widows in public life and decision-making, generally speaking. The girls in the camps, we know that once they hit puberty, they're not able to go to learning centers. Child marriage is a huge problem. And like many patriarchal societies, there's this concept of izzat, which means the family's social honor, which is directly linked to a woman's perceived sexual purity. And that concept actually is something that really goes to the root of the stigmatization that a lot of SGBV survivors from Myanmar still face. And I know that we'll perhaps circle back on this and get some time to talk about it, but I think it's important to mention that in one of the studies that we did on the long-term impact of SGBV on the Rohingya women, one of the key findings was the extreme ostracization of the Rohingya women who have faced SGBV. And we worked with this fantastic team of psychiatrists, psychologists, and anthropologists who really explained to us the underlying idea of this ostracization, which is that the community views them as a reminder of the horrific crimes that took place, which the Rohingya men could not prevent and protect. And so they view them as traumatic emblems, which the community needs to get rid of. So it is not easy the stigma is very real. And one can imagine that being a part of something like Shanti Mohila, what it symbolizes, it's not easy, but they have still persevered, and they are not just speaking on behalf of the community or voicing out their demands for justice, but they are also acknowledging that the SGBV took place in that kind of a conservative society. So there has been a lot of challenges, but they have really persevered.
So you explained that these women are seen kind of as unwelcome reminders of this sexual and gender-based violence. Can you say something, without going into too much gruesome details, about the scale and the brutality of this violence? Because as I have seen some of the reporting, it's very large scale, and it seems like everybody in those camps has seen bits of it. So can you explain a bit about the scale of the brutality, and also why then they're trying to suppress the reminders of it?
So the scale was massive indeed of the sexual violence that took place in Myanmar in 2017. The survivors of sexual violence, they belonged to villages across all 3 Rohingya townships in the northern Rakhine state in Myanmar, where the major incidents took place during the operations. And the patterns, the systemic nature that you were sort of referring to in your question, in which this sexual violence was carried out against the Rohingya women, it's particularly stark if you speak to any investigator, interviewer in the Rohingya context. They would highlight the frequency of a very large-scale gang rape involving multiple perpetrators, multiple victims in locations that were specifically chosen, such as school compounds, police compounds, military compounds, and even houses that were specifically chosen for that. And 80% of the incidents of rape that were corroborated by the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar were gang rapes. So that really tells us something about the brutality and the scale. There were, of course, rape incidents that took place at home, at the survivors' home, where the military entered as part of the attacks, or when the women were dragged away to forests while they were fleeing from Myanmar into Bangladesh, especially in the months leading up to the 2017. And I think it's important to take note of that to set out the context of the operations. The women were facing sexual violence even before the large-scale military operations started. During the regular patrolling by the security forces, the women were taken away, abducted for 3 to 4 days and subjected to sexual violence during that. But yes, there's something to be said about the very stark pattern that is seen in the 2017 operations about women and men being systematically separated, and then the women being taken to the schools, being mass gang raped, and then being left to die, really. A lot of the survivors have shared with us that they don't really believe how they survived the situation or how they are still alive, really, because they were really left to die. And a lot of them pretended to be dead or hid under the bodies to be able to protect themselves. So it was particularly cruel, and it was being done all in a public setting, which is why the knowledge of SGBV for a lot of the survivors, unfortunately, is public. And that really goes to the root of them being seen as those horrific reminders, unfortunately. Of course, during our interviews, investigations, in our documentation work, we take a lot of care to make sure that their identities are protected. But whenever we have spoken to the women whose rape is knowledge within the other members of their villages, we see a particularly high level of stigmatization and ostracization, including for their own children who are not able to, their own daughters who can't remarry because of their mother's status.
So I find it quite difficult to listen to you and then also think again about how to formulate questions, because it's just very difficult stuff that you're dealing with, let alone what they're dealing with. I am wondering, when you were speaking there, I used the word patterns in relation to these sexual and gender-based crimes, which makes me think very specifically of crimes against humanity, where we know that you need to be able to prove, in some sense, the widespread and sometimes the pattern there. But how is it that you show that sexual and gender-based crimes actually have some kind of genocidal intent behind them? What is it that is needed in terms of the evidence that these women can provide, or what they can say? Is it what happened to them? Is it what was said to them? Is it the way that they were specifically targeted? Is it how generations were targeted? What is it that happens that makes it some form of genocidal intent?
Thanks so much for asking that, Janet. I think that's a very important question. And as much as it's important, it's also a very difficult question for the legal actors who are involved in any case that has anything to do with genocide. I just want to take a step back to perhaps go to the definition of the crime of genocide. Indeed, like you said, there is a requirement that the underlying acts, such as the killing, the physical, bodily, and mental harm, the imposition of measures preventing births, that all of these underlying acts need to be committed with the specific intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. And sexual violence, actually, depending upon its not just the systematic and widespread nature, which are, of course, very relevant elements to prove when we are trying to look at sexual violence as a crime against humanity, but the pattern and the context, the brutality and the scale in which it is carried out can also give very valuable insights to infer the intent to destroy the group, considering that rape can be a very effective method of isolating, humiliating men and women of the same culture, considering how forced impregnation can be used to dilute an ethnicity, an ethnic group, especially in a patrilineal society, which is what we have at hand with the Rohingya society. So it is important to examine rape in the manner as the perpetrators view it when we are talking about charging sexual violence as genocide, because it can give very important, valuable insights as to what the perpetrators had in mind.
When you're talking about the kind of culture and how perpetrators used it, that reminds me very much of all the reporting and testimony we've seen out of Bosnia and parts of the Bosnian genocide, where there were also widespread rapes and women were told that they would not be able to carry Bosnian children anymore and things like that. Do you think that the Rohingya culture and the fact that it is such a patriarchal society where the family honor is so important is something that was specifically targeted by the Myanmar military to try and destroy the group by destroying the women and their reproductive ability? Can you talk a bit about how this culture interacts with what you can then specifically target to destroy a group?
I absolutely agree with you, Steph. I think it is the knowledge on part of the Myanmar military of the religious, cultural, societal norms of the Rohingya society that have a lot to do with the way in which the rapes and the sexual violence took place in a very cruel and public way. And that goes on to tell us a lot about their intent. It's important to think about the fact that the sexual violence against the Rohingya took place in the context of a very carefully planned state project to control and expel the Rohingya out of the country. The official documents by this organization called CIJA, which studied in one of its reports the official documents, it revealed that the authorities had an obsession with reducing the Rohingya population that they viewed as an existential threat to the survival of the nation. So not only was the SGBV being committed as part of the 2017 military operations, which were, of course, very devastating, but it was also a part of the larger premeditated plan against the group. And given their existing knowledge, like we were discussing, of the Rohingya culture and society, the Myanmar military can be said to be fully aware that in the ordinary course of events, their acts of SGBV would result in severely negative social and reproductive implications for the group. Moreover, I think it's important to add here that it is said in the reports, including the one by CIJA, that the Myanmar military has a very deep hierarchical and bureaucratic structure. So there is a reasonable cause to believe that the SGBV, which was happening at the scale that it did, was highly likely that it was controlled and overseen as part of the formal command structure even. And from the perspective of the perpetrators, like I was mentioning, that it's important to think about that as well. It is really difficult to counter the argument that the Rohingya girls and women were physically mutilated to be left unable to reproduce, traumatized to an extent that they can no longer contemplate a procreative relationship, even if they were accepted within the Rohingya community.
You mentioned there, CIJA. We should just spell out that acronym, maybe. The Commission for International Justice and Accountability. We've had them on the podcast before, and we'll do a link to that Myanmar report. I wanted to introduce another couple of acronyms as well. The ICC, International Criminal Court. We know that they also have applications for arrest warrants out in the Myanmar case. And we know that the IIMM, that's the investigative mechanism, Myanmar has been working on this. So you're not working in isolation on this. And I was looking back through some of the history of the Argentina case, and one of the lower courts said, look, there's plenty of other people involved. Why do we need to do this? So from your perspective, how does this mix of different organizations work? Is this the case that we need to be following, or do we need to be looking at everything everywhere all at once, and we need to watch all of these different things? Also, we've got the International Court of Justice. How do you see it, Ishita? And how do the people that you're working with from this women's group, how do they see it?
All of the ongoing justice and accountability mechanisms are serving their own purpose and hold a great deal of importance to the survivors who are part of it. Even though they are all addressing the Rohingya crisis as a whole, the human rights crisis as a whole that is going on in Myanmar. However, there are certain differences that have allowed for each of these mechanisms to accept jurisdiction with respect to certain crimes and not necessarily create a conflict. You mentioned about the lower court decision in Argentina. That was actually overturned by the appeals court, recognizing that the principle of complementarity with the ICC would go on to mean that, in fact, the Argentinian proceedings can proceed because the ICC is looking at the crime of deportation and other cross-border elements of crimes against humanity, and not necessarily the crimes that have happened on the territory in Myanmar, because Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, which is why the proceedings in Argentina are very important in that they have been able to inquire and explore the charge of genocide as well. The arrest warrants have been issued, but the confirmation of charges hearing does happen at a later stage, just to add that side note. But yes, it is indeed looking at the crime of genocide along with the crimes against humanity, which differentiates it a bit from the ICC proceedings. And of course, the ICJ case is an interstate proceeding with the potential, in case the ruling is in favor of the state of Gambia, for there to be a potential for a number of orders that can be very helpful for the future of Myanmar as well.
Yeah, we should do a little Stephopedia on the ICJ case and the differences. One of the reasons that you already touched upon, that the ICC is only looking at deportation and cross-border crimes, is indeed, as you mentioned, that Myanmar is not a member state of the ICC, but neighboring Bangladesh is, and they had looked at this and judges had decided that if part of the crimes have a cross-border element like deportation, or there are crimes happening in Myanmar that prevent people from returning, then those are things that the judges could look at. Now, genocide doesn't have a cross-border element necessarily, and so that's why the ICC cannot look into these allegations of genocide or other crimes against humanity specifically. They may try to at some point, but we don't know. And you have the ICJ case where, as you said, that is an interstate case where one state accuses the other of committing genocide. And we are there at the stage where preliminary objections to it were rejected. We've had some provisional measures that Myanmar should stop, but that was still under the old government. And we're now, as with every ICJ case, it takes years before they actually get to the substance of the case. And that's what we're doing now. We're waiting for them to set hearings on the substance of the case. But I have no way of knowing if this would be this year or next year or when it will be.
That's right, Steph. We are also not aware from the ICJ's press release so far about when the merits hearing will be taking place, but it is expected to take place sometime late this year or the next year, perhaps. So it's not very far away.
In terms of these women appearing in all of these different spaces and getting the chance to testify or to give the information to courts, they have been in Buenos Aires and they have spoken directly to the investigative judges there. Ishita, how was that for these women?
Thanks for asking about that, Janet. The mission to Buenos Aires for the 7 witnesses who traveled all the way from Cox's Bazar to Argentina to testify in these proceedings was really something incredible, mainly because it was absolutely unprecedented. This was the very first time that the Rohingya survivors got an opportunity to share their accounts before prosecutorial authority as part of an investigative hearing. So it was definitely symbolically a very big opportunity for them. They are aware that this is not the ultimate solution to all of their problems, all of testifying before these courts and all of the evidence that our other clients have also over the years helped us prepare for the international legal proceedings. But they do believe in better overall outcomes that can be achieved through this. And in fact, they are the ones who, during their community awareness sessions, also inform people about the fact that what are the realistic outcomes of these processes. So they are very much aware of it. But at the same time, like I said, they believe in better overall outcomes, not just for themselves, but for their future generations as well. I still remember one of the witnesses who was testifying in the court at Buenos Aires who mentioned this directly to the prosecutor as part of her testimony, that had her grandparents fought for this years back, it could have been a possibility for her to lead perhaps a peaceful life in Myanmar. So I think from their perspective, to some extent, which is also quite sad, but they know that they're doing it for their future generations so that they can have a chance to go back to Myanmar and live peacefully.
And you said briefly already that in Argentina they had issued arrest warrants, but there has not been a confirmation of charges yet. What is the timeline on when you expect something to happen in the Buenos Aires case?
So unfortunately, we don't have an exact timeline on that case because it's going to depend on the political willingness of the countries to really enforce those arrest warrants. And before that happens, in fact, there's still one procedural step left, which is for the Argentinian authorities to approach Interpol to request them to publish a red notice, which, from what we understand, has not happened so far. So why we don't have a timeline, I think, like I mentioned, it's important to value the importance of the judge's decision because it goes on to show that there are reasonable grounds for the military to be held to account for genocidal crimes against humanity.
It's always really tough to kind of stop the podcast because we have so many questions that we want to ask you and we'd like to go back to earlier things, but we need to just wrap it up. But let's just give you an opportunity. Is there something you would like to say more about or something that we didn't manage to ask you that you would like to get in at this point? Go for it, Ishita.
I just want to perhaps add about the roles that the Shanti Mohila are playing in their community. The Shanti Mohila leaders that we are working with, they're playing an important role as grassroots advocates in their community in a number of different ways. We have the firstly awareness raising part of their work. They have been receiving trainings and capacity building sessions from Legal Action Worldwide, where they are made aware of what all of these proceedings really mean at the ICJ, the ICC, and in turn, they're able to do their community awareness sessions. They do that in very small groups because the security situation doesn't allow for them to have very large-scale sessions. And it is very important to some extent mitigate the frustrations that are there in the camps due to the protracted nature of the crisis. And considering that there's an ongoing civil war in Myanmar right now, which makes the resolution of the crisis extremely difficult and the repatriation in a dignified, voluntary way distant, unfortunately. Equally important is that their awareness-raising sessions has helped them to encourage survivors to step forward to connect with lawyers if they wish to participate and contribute to the legal proceedings. So they would connect survivors with us, or sometimes, depending upon the needs of our legal interventions or interventions by other justice actors, they connect us to specific women with specific profiles from certain villages. And when we do onboard clients, the Shanti Mohila play a very important role of providing peer support to those clients thereon, not just for the duration of the time that we are interviewing those clients or taking their testimony, etc., but to maintain that relationship as a peer support, which I think as lawyers, it's extremely important for us in a context where access and just giving a phone call is very difficult. So they help us stay in touch with them. And I think it's important to mention that the Shanti Mohila have been really commended for the work that they have done to the community, which has come as a surprise to them as well, considering the patriarchal norms, etc., that we were talking about earlier. So this has really boosted their confidence. They are trying to now get in touch with and talk to diaspora leaders as well within the Rohingya community so that they can use the access to the key fora, the UN fora and other fora that they have to relay their messaging from the camps. So they have been in touch with the Rohingya diaspora leaders and activists as well more recently. And I think, and our team thinks, that it can be a very important role that they play in the future as the political situation and conflict in Myanmar evolves, because there is a very urgent need for there to be a counter narrative in the camps. The security situation in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar has been deteriorating. There are public speeches by criminal groups to the youth in the Rohingya community to go to Myanmar to fight against the Arakan army. So it is something that an actor like Shanti Mahila can really step in for as well, so that they can advocate for solutions that are more rooted in the rule of law.
Thank you for that. At the end of our podcast, apart from this, what didn't we ask you questions that we should have, we also have our more quirky asymmetrical haircuts questions. And one of them is, we are all legal geeks on this podcast, and you are also a lawyer. And so we always ask, do you have a favorite court case, something that you teach, something that was inspirational to you, something that you were in that was just odd and that you like to talk about? Anything goes at this point, but a favorite court case.
Keeping in mind the topic that we have just discussed about sexual violence and how it links to the crime of genocide, I think what has always been very helpful for me to keep going back to and also to discuss in our team when we were especially preparing that massive report on the impact of SGBV on the Rohingya women, men, and the Hijra community is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda's judgment in Akayesu, which was groundbreaking in terms of establishing the relationship between SGBV and how it can constitute not just as an act of genocide, but also genocide in itself, and show us the intent. We spoke about this a little bit earlier in our conversation as well, but I'm happy to elaborate a little if I can.
Yeah, tell us more. I mean, a lot of people do pick Akayesu as a really important case, and I know that Navanathan Pillay has spoken about it, but I have the feeling we should get back to her and say, hey, let's just do a podcast just on that one. If you could ask her a question, what would you ask her?
I think with Akayesu, what it really did, which has been very helpful for us when we are looking at the Rohingya situation, specifically the sexual violence, is that it lays out certain interpretations of the very acts that constitute the crime of genocide. So we have very helpful interpretation guidance from Akayesu that the bodily and mental harm doesn't need to be irreparable, irreversible. It needs to be something that obstructs your ability to lead a normal and constructive life. We know also that from the judgment that rapes and mutilation can be considered as measures intended to prevent births within the group. But of course, when it comes to the question of intent to destroy and how does that link to sexual violence, I think there's a lot to be said on that. We know that the judgment makes a reference to the fact that rape as an act can be, considering the circumstances, considered to indicate the destruction of the spirit, of the will itself to live. And I think that to me is a very interesting part, which I would love to hear more from an expert as to how much does the sexual violence in question need to be related to the concept of destruction, and what are the contours of this concept of destruction so that the intent can be inferred.
Our other question is, what do you have on your nightstand? What books are you reading? What are you listening to in terms of podcasts? And what is on your Netflix queue? Anything you want to talk about that either relates to what we're talking about or anything that you do to get away from the things you have to deal with on a daily basis and the stories you hear?
I have to confess that what I'm watching and listening to is very far from the topics that we have discussed. I'm a huge fan of Japanese anime, so that's really what is on my list of watching right now. And I would, however, suggest that documentary that has recently been published, which involves one of our Rohingya colleagues. It's called A Dream Called Kushi. It's also gotten awards and recognition, which is incredible to see. So I believe that would be something I'd like to suggest for people to watch.
Wonderful. We will put a link to that, but of course you can't leave us hanging with the anime. What is then your favorite anime movie that we should all be watching together with, of course, the dream called Kushi?
It's Kushi, yes, which means joy in English. For the anime, I would go with Attack on Titan because that's my all-time favorite. Even though what I have watched recently by the same studio, Moonrise, is a very good thing to binge on, but Attack on Titan for sure.
Great. Thank you so much, Ishita, for giving us some insight into how this group of Rohingya women have been operating and how they've been interacting with the courts. And you've inspired us, I think, with another idea for another podcast to really look at some of the aspects of genocide in more depth and to understand better the connection that we could possibly make on sexual and gender-based violence and genocide and where the contours lie there. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me again. It was a delight to talk about this, have this conversation.
Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch, and do let us know if there's any updates on the Argentina case, because we'll be following that as well.
I will. Yes, I will.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.
Just to say, you can also support this podcast. Check out our supporters page, and there you'll find details of our Patreon and our newsletter.
Yeah, if you haven't had enough of us chatting about war crimes and making inappropriate jokes, then go over to Patreon, where you can get extra bonus content where Janet and I run our own War Criminals book club. We read books about war criminals. We don't commit our own.
And it's just the price of a cup of coffee. So see you there.